Barris had always prided himself on being adaptable. Growing up on the harsh mining colonies of Kepler 442b had taught him that survival meant rolling with whatever the universe threw at you. But nothing, not asteroid storms, not reactor failures, not even the time he'd been stranded in a broken EVA suit for 6 hours, had prepared him for living with Insia. The Vulpine Exchange program was supposed to be humanity's first step toward diplomatic relations with the fox-like aliens who had recently made contact. Earth's xenobiologists were fascinated by their resemblance to terrestrial foxes, despite being fully sapient beings who had mastered faster-than-light travel centuries before humans had even invented the wheel. The program paired human volunteers with young Vulpine ambassadors for cultural immersion. What the program coordinators hadn't mentioned was that some Vulpine harbored deep resentments about humanity's rapid technological advancement. "Your species is reckless," Insia had declared on her first day in his small apartment on Luna Station. Her rust-colored ears twitched with agitation, and her fluffy tail lashed behind her like an angry metronome. "You went from discovering fire to splitting atoms in mere millennia. Most civilized species take 50 times as long." Barris had simply nodded and shown her to the spare room he'd prepared, complete with the specialized sleeping alcove that Vulpine preferred. He'd researched their customs thoroughly, learning about their pack-based social structures, their preference for dim lighting, and their dietary requirements. He'd even installed a small garden pod to grow the specific fungi they considered a delicacy. "I don't need your pity accommodations," she'd snapped, but he'd caught her examining the alcove with what might have been approval. For the first month, Insia maintained her distance. She attended her required cultural seminars during the day, returned home with barely a word, and retreated to her room. When she spoke to him at all, it was to point out humanity's flaws, their wasteful consumption, their tendency toward violence, their inability to think beyond their own short lifespans. "Your people fight wars over resources while sitting on planets full of them," she'd said one evening, watching him prepare dinner. "It's inefficient." "Maybe," Barris had replied, carefully seasoning the synthetic protein according to Vulpine taste preferences he'd memorized. "But we also wrote symphonies while we were dying of plague, and we sent art into space before we knew if anyone would ever find it. Efficiency isn't everything." Her ears had flattened against her head, a sign of confusion he'd learned, but she'd said nothing more. The first crack in her armor came during a power outage. Luna Station's backup systems had failed, plunging their sector into darkness. Barris had found Insia pressed against her door, pupils dilated with fear. Vulpine had excellent night vision, but they were deeply uncomfortable in complete darkness, an evolutionary response to the cave predators of their homeworld. Without a word, he'd activated his emergency light stick and placed it outside her door before returning to his room. In the morning, she'd mumbled something that might have been gratitude, but her usual hostility seemed muted. The second crack came when she fell ill. Vulpine rarely got sick, but when they did, it hit hard. Barris had found her collapsed in the common area, burning with fever. Instead of taking her to the station's medical bay, where human doctors would have treated her with impersonal efficiency, he'd researched Vulpine traditional remedies, prepared cooling broths according to her grandmother's recipe that she'd mentioned once, and sat by her alcove reading human poetry in a soft voice. "Why?" she'd asked when her fever broke, her voice hoarse and confused. "Because that's what humans do," he'd replied simply. "We take care of our pack." She'd stared at him with those amber eyes, and for the first time, he'd seen something other than disdain in them. But it was the third incident that changed everything. Pirates, desperate scavengers from the outer colonies, had somehow breached Luna Station's defenses. While security forces responded, residents were ordered to shelter in place. Barris had barricaded their apartment and armed himself with a mining laser he'd kept from his colony days. "You should hide," he'd told Insia. "If they break in, you can't fight them alone," she'd interrupted, and he'd been shocked to see her ears pinned back in determination rather than fear. "Vulpine have better reflexes, better hearing." They'd worked together, her senses guiding him as they moved through the darkened corridors to help evacuate other residents. She'd watched in fascination as he jury-rigged emergency communications, sealed hull breaches with improvised patches, and coordinated rescue efforts with nothing but determination and human stubbornness. When it was over, she'd looked at him with something approaching wonder. "Your species shouldn't exist," she'd said quietly as they sat in their apartment sharing a meal in the aftermath. You're too young, too chaotic. By every statistical model, you should have destroyed yourselves millennia ago. But we didn't, Barris had pointed out. No, she'd agreed, and her tail had curved around to rest near his feet, a gesture of trust he'd never seen before. You didn't. Now, 3 months into their cohabitation, Barris lay in his bed listening to the soft sounds from the corridor outside. Every night, Insia emerged from her room after she thought he was asleep. He could hear her padding quietly to his door, the soft whisper of her settling down against it, and the barely audible rhythm of her breathing as she slept. She still claimed to hate humans during the day, still pointed out their flaws, still argued about their reckless nature and impossible luck. But every morning he found a few rust-colored hairs on the floor outside his door, and every evening she prepared enough dinner for 2 without being asked. Vulpine were pack animals after all, and despite everything she said, despite her complaints and criticisms and constant reminders of humanity's shortcomings, she had apparently decided that Barris was worth protecting, even if she would never admit it out loud. As he drifted off to sleep, Barris smiled at the soft sound of her settling down outside his door once again. Tomorrow she would probably lecture him about humanity's wasteful use of resources or their tendency toward emotional decision-making. But tonight, like every night, she chose to guard his dreams. And maybe, he thought drowsily, that said more about both their species than any diplomatic treaty ever could.